The rain had been trying to kill the city all night. Maya Ose felt it in her socks first, cold moving up through the rubber soles of boots she'd owned for 4 years, soaking through the cotton, settling against her skin with the patient malice of something that had always intended to get there. She was 2 blocks from home, double shift done, 11 hours on a lathe that needed to be replaced, in a shop that couldn't afford to replace it, and every joint in her lower back was filing a formal complaint. She had groceries. She had her nephew Marcus waiting on a geometry test. She had, by any honest count, nothing left to give this city tonight. Then she saw the jack. It was a floor jack, hydraulic, red, the kind sold in sets with roadside emergency kits to people who would never actually use them. Someone had used it. Someone had used it badly. The black Audi Q8 sat at a hard list in the middle of 48th Street, right front wheel flat, the jack positioned under the rocker panel with the base plate sitting in the center of a pothole she recognized by its exact dimensions because she'd filed 3 311 complaints about it in the last 11 months and watched the city patch it with tar twice, both times wrong. The asphalt around the base was softening in the rain. She could see the plate sinking. Not dramatically, not all at once, the way disaster never announces itself, but incrementally, the way all structural failures begin. 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. The car would be on the ground inside 6 minutes. She set her groceries against the curb. She didn't think about it the way other people thought about thinking. She felt it instead. The same way she felt when a machine was about to throw a belt or a pipe was about to blow a seal. That vibration in the chest that was equal parts pattern recognition and something older, something that didn't have a technical name. The jack needed a stable base. The asphalt wasn't it. She looked around. There was a chunk of broken curbing 6 feet back, knocked loose by something heavier than it in a season when the ground had been soft. She dragged it through the water with both hands, the edge open in a line across her left palm that she wouldn't notice bleeding until later, and worked it under the base plate by feel, by pressure, by the specific knowledge of how load distributes across imperfect surfaces when you have no choice but to improvise. Then she reset the jack, recranked it carefully. Whoever had set it had overpumped. Amateur mistake. More height without more stability is just a slower fall, and began the lift. The lug nuts fought her. Factory torqued, probably machine set, the breaker bar from the roadside kit giving her nothing useful in terms of leverage. She stood on it, her full weight, 142 pounds of exhaustion and wet denim, until the first one cracked loose, then the next, then all 5. She had the spare on in 8 minutes. Her knees were black with road mud. Her left hand was bleeding freely into the rain. She stood up. The man on the sidewalk had been there the whole time. She'd clocked him the way you clock something that doesn't fit. Tall, still, dry under an umbrella someone else was holding for him. He was watching her with an expression that she couldn't classify, and that bothered her more than it should have. Not impressed, not grateful, something more unsettling, the focused attention of a man who was recalculating something. He wore charcoal. No rain had touched him. Behind him, a second black SUV had materialized at the curb while she'd been working, and she counted, without meaning to, 4 men in identical black jackets, positioned at intervals on both sides of the street, as if the block had been quietly reorganized around her while her back was turned. She picked up her groceries. The bag had split at the seam, and she held it from underneath. "That," the man said, quiet, calibrated, the voice of someone who had never needed volume. "That was not a simple thing you just did." She looked at the tire. She looked at him. She was aware fully and suddenly of how she must appear, blood on her hand, asphalt on her knees, locks plastered flat against her neck, standing in 6 inches of running water on a midtown street at 10:30 at night. She was also aware that she had just prevented a $120,000 vehicle from destroying its own chassis using a piece of broken curb and her own body weight, and that this was, by any technical assessment, a significant thing. The base was sinking. You needed more contact surface. The concrete gave you 14 extra square inches, enough to hold the lift. He looked at her for a long moment, not the way people look when they're listening, the way they look when they're deciding. "Your name," he said. She told him. He nodded once, a filing motion, not a response, and turned towards the SUV. The door opened. He stepped in and then stopped, his hand on the frame. He didn't look back. "You dropped something," he said. She looked down. An orange had rolled from the split bag into the gutter. It was spinning in the current of rainwater moving towards the drain, getting smaller, catching the streetlight for one rotation, then two, and then it was gone. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that Elliot Thorne's company had spent 14 months quietly acquiring the land on both sides of the exact block she was standing on. She didn't know that the pothole she just used as leverage sat at the epicenter of a redevelopment plan covering 18 blocks, her 18 blocks, or that by tomorrow morning the shape of her life would begin to change in ways she could not yet see. She only knew that something had passed between them in the rain that was not gratitude and not transaction, and that it had weight she hadn't agreed to carry. She walked home, holding the groceries from the bottom, and the orange was already in the drain, and the rain kept falling, and the jack sat in the road behind her like a question she hadn't finished answering.
She heard the engines at 7:04 in the morning, not loud. That was the thing that made her stop mid-pour and actually pay attention. Expensive engines don't need to be loud. They idle like held breath. She set the coffee down and looked out the window and felt something drop in her chest that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. 5 of them. Black SUVs, the same model, the same tint, positioned in a formation that was either coincidental or deliberate, and nothing about it was coincidental. 4 sealed the south end of her block. 1 sat at the north. The people heading to the bus stop were slowing down, taking their phones out, posting what they were seeing to whatever account would validate their instinct that this was wrong. Mrs. Delacroix from 3B was on the stoop with her arms crossed, wearing the expression she reserved for floods and funerals. Maya turned from the window. Marcus was eating cereal without looking up from his phone, the specific imperviousness of a 14-year-old boy who had decided that the external world was largely irrelevant before 9 a.m. She said his name once, in the tone that ended conversations. He looked up. "Don't be late," she said. She pulled on jeans and went downstairs. The man who got out of the center vehicle was not the man from last night. He was younger, mid-30s, jaw set with the specific confidence of someone who had been excellent at school and been rewarded for it so consistently that he'd confused the reward for the quality. He held a business card between 2 fingers as if presenting a verdict. "Ms. Osei?" He didn't phrase it as a question because he already knew the answer. She looked at the card. Thorne Enterprises, 57th Street, floor 44, the kind of address that existed to remind you where you were in the hierarchy before you'd said a word. "About what?" she said. The man smiled with the precise wattage of someone who practiced it. "Mr. Thorne prefers to explain himself." She thought about the orange in the gutter. She thought about the machine shop where Jimmy Chen had called her aside 2 weeks ago and said the words workforce restructuring in the careful tone of a man delivering a diagnosis. She thought about 60 days on her lease renewal and a number that gone up 11% and the particular kind of math you do when you know you're losing. 10 minutes, she said. The lobby of Thorne Enterprises was larger than her apartment building's entire footprint. She cataloged this not with awe, but with the habitual precision of someone who measured spaces, load calculations, square footage, load per square foot, and found that it communicated its own argument about scale before anyone in it had spoken. Elliot Thorne was standing at the window when she entered, not sitting behind a desk, standing at the glass, hands in his pockets, looking out at a city that looked from this elevation like something someone had designed, orderly, intentional, nothing like what she knew it to be at street level. He didn't offer her a seat, he just started talking, which she noted, the absent-minded authority of a man who had never once needed to manage the comfort level of a room. He'd had 2 engineers look at her jack repair that morning, both with degrees. Neither of them, he said, had thought of using the curbing as a load distribution base. He'd looked into her. He said it without apology, which she respected more than she wanted to. He'd found the drainage project, the one she'd designed and pushed through the community board 2 years ago, the redirected runoff system that had stopped 4 blocks from flooding every wet spring with porous paving and rechanneled outflow that had cost the city less than a single pothole repair. He'd had a structural engineer review her math on it. Your calculations were more accurate than the city's, he said. The city's engineer had never been in those basements, she said. He turned from the window then. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but recalibration. The same thing she'd seen on the sidewalk in the rain. He told her what he was building, not the version she'd have heard in a pitch deck, the glass towers, the mixed-use language, the word revitalization worn smooth from overuse. The real version, a corridor development spanning the south end of the borough, 12 buildings over 6 years, requiring the kind of applied engineering that didn't come from models, but from hands. He needed people who understood how structures actually met the ground. His current team was excellent on paper. She was something different. The number he offered was indecent. She didn't let her face do anything with it. It took everything she had. "I don't have a degree," she said. "I'm aware. Your team's problem is my problem to manage." She looked out the window. Her city, unrecognizable from here, flattened by height into something that looked like it could be planned, could be controlled. She'd grown up knowing that it couldn't be. She'd spent her whole life working in the gap between what the plan said and what the ground actually did. She thought about Marcus, about the machine shop, about the word yet hanging over 2 positions that weren't hers but could be. She thought, I can do more good inside than outside. She would think about that thought many times in the months that followed, and what it had cost her to believe it. "When do I start?" she said. Thorne nodded, one short motion, the way he did everything, economical, final. On the way out, she passed the man with the business card in the hallway. He was on his phone. He didn't look up. His name, she would learn later, was Dominic Voss. She would have no reason to remember it yet. She took the elevator down alone and walked out through the lobby and into the street, and the sun was out for the first time in 4 days, and her city looked exactly the way it always looked, difficult, real, and entirely hers, and she didn't look back.
The MIT alumni directory was on her desk when she arrived. Not face down, not tucked under something, placed open, spine up, at the center of her workstation like a document she'd left there herself. She looked at it for a moment, then turned it over and put her bag down and opened her laptop, because the message had been received and the appropriate response was not to receive it. The engineering floor of Thorne Enterprises operated at a specific frequency she'd identified within the first hour. Everyone here knew their credentials the way people in other places knew their blood type, constantly and as the first thing they reached for when threatened. 6 Ivy League degrees within workstation range of hers. She'd counted them, because counting load-bearing points was reflex, and she'd learned to read rooms the same way she read structures, find where the weight actually sits. The lead project manager's name was Garrett Hale, Princeton, then MIT for his master's, then 7 years at a firm in Chicago that had built 4 of the tallest buildings in the Midwest. He shook her hand on day 1 with the particular grip of a man who had decided something before she arrived and was confirming it. He was not rude. He was precise and comprehensive in his dismissal, the way expensive suits are dismissive, not by being cheap, but by being complete. She let it go. She had bigger problems. She'd spent the night before her first day pulling every public record she could find on the South Innovation Corridor. City planning filings, environmental reviews, geological survey data from the municipal database that nobody read because it was formatted for the 1990s and required a specific patience to navigate. She'd navigated it. What she'd found had her kept at the kitchen table until 2 a.m., and when Marcus had patted out in his socks and asked what she was doing, she'd said homework, which was true. When Garrett presented the preliminary load analysis for Meridian Tower, their flagship, the anchor building for the whole corridor development, 50 stories of glass and steel on the western end of the site, she sought through it quietly.
The renderings were extraordinary. She understood why. Beautiful things cost more and justify themselves, which was why people who built expensive things invested so heavily in making them look inevitable. She waited until he'd finished. The subsoil variance on the western parcels, what are you using for your bearing capacity estimates? The room went the specific quiet of a classroom when someone asks the question the teacher didn't prepare for. Garrett looked at her with an expression she recognized, a man finding something in a space where he'd expected nothing. He recovered in about 2 seconds, which was fast. Standard urban core assumptions, it's been modeled. Which parcel specifically did the model pull soil data from? A different pause this time, shorter but more complex. The corridors treated as a homogeneous zone for preliminary phase modeling. Maya turned her laptop screen so the room could see it. She'd had the geological survey pulled up since before he'd started presenting. The soil stratification map for the western parcels showed something that was not homogeneous, a wide band of historic fill running under 6 of the 12 planned buildings, the accumulated century-long consequence of industrial remediation and informal development in a neighborhood that had been used and rebuilt and used again. It was the kind of ground that behaved one way in a dry summer and a completely different way in a wet spring when the water table rose. This is public data, she said. City Geological Survey. The fill layer under the western section runs between 11 and 17 feet deep. Your bearing capacity assumptions don't account for the variance. Garrett looked at the screen. He looked at her. He was doing the calculation, not the engineering one, the other one, the one about what this meant for him and for the room. "We'll flag it for Phase 2 review," he said. She nodded. She knew what flagging it for Phase 2 meant. It meant burying it in a later document where it could be addressed, minimized, or reformatted until it said something more convenient. She had spent enough time watching cities handle inconvenient infrastructure data to know exactly how that process worked. But she was new, and she was smart enough to know new and right at the same time was a combination that made enemies faster than wrong, so she said nothing more, and closed her laptop and let the presentation continue. After the meeting, Garrett didn't speak to her for the rest of the day. 2 of the engineers from the flanking workstation stopped saying good morning. These were small losses. She absorbed them. A message she didn't expect came at 4:40 p.m. from a junior engineer named Priya Anand, who sat 2 workstations to her left and had been watching the meeting with an expression of careful neutrality. Nice pull. Nobody actually checks the surveys. And then, after a pause, I did once. Garrett told me it wasn't my area. Maya stared at that message for a long time. She typed back, "When was this?" Priya, 8 months ago. Meridian site, eastern parcels. I flagged a drainage concern. It disappeared into Phase 2. Maya saved the message. She closed the window. She sat very still for a moment in the specific way of someone who had just found a load-bearing element that shouldn't be where it is. Then she opened the geological survey again and started reading forward from the eastern parcels. What she'd found in the next 2 hours didn't alarm her immediately. Alarm was the response of someone who didn't already know what ground this city was built on. It confirmed something she'd known in her body since the first time she'd seen the corridor maps, something that felt like a loose bolt in a machine that was still running, a vibration that wasn't right but hadn't become a problem yet. The difference between not yet and not ever was an engineering document she didn't have access to, yet.
She found it on a Tuesday, 11:14 p.m. in a server folder with no name, not labeled restricted, not password protected, just absent from the indexed project directory, the way a room gets left out of a floor plan, not hidden exactly, just not included in the version of the building that gets shown to people. If she hadn't been running a diagnostic on the infrastructure model, a task assigned to her specifically because it was tedious and no one else wanted it, she would never have been in that section of the server at all, which, she understood later, was entirely the point. The folder was labeled UR Phase 3 Final. She opened it the way you open something that doesn't belong to you, carefully, with one eye on the door. What she found inside was the real version of the Urban Renewal Initiative, not the presentation deck version with the parklets and the community gathering spaces and the mixed income integration model, the one with photographs of smiling people who had not been asked permission for their smiles to appear in a development prospectus. The operational version, the one with actual parcel maps marked by acquisition status, displacement projections listed not as ethical concerns but as logistical variables, timelines calibrated not around community readiness but around city council vote cycles and permit windows. She scrolled slowly. The office was empty. Her screen was the only light. The maps covered 18 blocks. She knew these blocks the way she knew her own hands, by feel, by repetition, by the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 small ordinary acts performed in the same geography. She knew which corner deli was run by Mr. Kim, who had been open since 1989 and kept a photo of his first lease on the wall behind the register. She knew the bus stop on Clement that ran late on Thursdays, and how if you missed it, you had exactly enough time to get coffee at the place across the street before the next one came. She knew the sound her building made in a high wind, the way old buildings have their own specific frequencies, their own vocabulary for weather. The parcels were color-coded: green, acquired; yellow, in negotiation; red, pending action. She found her building on the third map. It was red. She sat with that for a moment, the specific airless quality of a moment when something you couldn't have named as a fear becomes a confirmed fact. There was a notation beside the parcel number, D/E order ref 7741, and she cross-referenced it in the document index without breathing and found what it stood for: demolition/eviction. The order had already been drafted. It was pending city council approval at a vote scheduled in 6 weeks. She looked at the entry for 4 seconds. Then she scrolled the map outward, tracking the red parcels, following the footprint of what was planned: her building, the building next door, the Mencia family's building across the street, the community laundry, the vacant lot where the summer basketball league played, where Marcus went 3 nights a week with the kind of single-minded focus he gave to almost nothing else. The school was 2 blocks from her building. She found it at the edge of the map. Yellow, not red yet, not fully committed, but yellow with a notation that it would convert to red pending enrollment data from the new development demographic model. Her brother Kofi had gone to that school, had walked those 2 blocks every morning for 6 years, including the winter of 2011 when her mother had been sick, and Maya had walked with him because she couldn't stand the thought of him going alone. He had died 4 years ago, not violently, not dramatically, just the specific quiet devastation of a young man who never found a foothold in a city that was very good at offering them and very good at taking them back. His son, Marcus, lived in the apartment that had been his mother's, slept in the room that had been his, walked to the same school. This was the only thread Maya had left of him. She closed the folder. She sat in the empty office and looked at the city through 44 floors of glass, all those lights, indifferent as they always were to whatever was happening at street level. And she thought about the 11 months she'd spent at this company, the first paycheck that had made her sit down on the edge of her bed and simply breathe, the coat, the ability to say yes to things instead of doing the calculation first, the way she'd started gradually and without noticing to think about her neighborhood from the outside, as a project site, as a corridor, as a zone. She opened the folder again. She took out her phone. She photographed every page of every document, steadily, without hurrying, the way you do a job you've decided to finish. 47 photographs. When she was done, she looked at what she'd done on her screen for a long moment, the small, neat fact of it, the threshold it represented, and she understood that she had just made a choice that could not be unmade. The fan in the ventilation system cycled on, then off. She cleared her browser history, closed the folder, and finished the diagnostics she'd been assigned. She clocked out at 11:52 p.m. and rode the elevator down alone, and walked out through the lobby and into the street. The air was cold. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt her phone and thought about the 47 photographs on it and walked faster than she needed to. She had 6 weeks. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do with them. She only knew that the ground had shifted under everything and that she was the only person in a position to feel it.
The money had changed her. She hadn't permitted herself to look at it directly, which meant it had been changing her in the dark. New boots, a coat she'd bought at full price without doing the math first. The luxury, and it was a luxury, she understood that now with a clarity she hadn't had while living it, of saying yes to Marcus's school trip without 3 days of calculation beforehand. These were not corruptions. She'd told herself that enough times to have worn the word smooth. They were corrections, natural equilibrium restored after years of deficit, reasonable rewards for unreasonable effort. But sitting at her kitchen table at 1:15 a.m. with her phone face down on the wood and the photographs burning somewhere behind her sternum, she understood what the money had also been doing. It had been building a wall between her and her block.
not with malice. Walls never had malice. They just stood there, making the distance feel structural, feel permanent, feel like a fact about geography rather than a choice about identity. She couldn't afford the wall anymore. She began the following Monday, carefully, the way you begin anything where the margin for error is the difference between outcome A and everything else. She was not reckless. Recklessness was for people with backup plans, and her backup plan had always been the same thing as her primary plan: do the work better than anyone else in the room and hope the room noticed. She worked inside her authorized access, pulling project files she had legitimate reason to be in, cross-referencing the firm's internal structural models against the geological data she'd been accumulating since her first week. Anyone watching her screen would have seen an engineer doing rigorous work. Anyone watching her screen was watching her screen. She knew this, and did it anyway. What she found, assembled piece by piece across 11 nights, was this: the geotechnical data that Thorne Enterprises had submitted to the city's planning board, the data that had formed the engineering basis for 4 residential towers between 30 and 50 stories, was not the data the firm had commissioned for internal use. The internal data, buried in a separate project subdirectory with a naming convention she'd only cracked because Priya had, in a moment of careful indirection, mentioned that the Phase 2 reports used a different reference format than Phase 1, was different. Not slightly, not within measurement variance. The internal data showed bearing capacity readings that should have triggered mandatory mitigation requirements under city code, deeper pilings, modified foundation geometry, potentially a full redesign on 2 of the 4 structures. The submitted data showed a version of the same soil that had been selectively sampled, the inconvenient readings smoothed into averages that crossed the compliance threshold cleanly. The buildings were not safe to build where they were planned to be built, not by the data Thorne's own engineers had collected, only by the version of it that had been presented to the city. She thought about the retaining wall on Albemarle Road. She'd been 12. A wet spring, same softened clay, same water table behavior she flagged in Garrett's meeting, and the wall came down at 3 in the morning with a sound she had never successfully described to anyone who hadn't heard it. Not a crash, more like a long, final exhalation, something that had been holding for too long, releasing everything at once. Nobody died because it failed inward rather than into the street. That was luck. Luck was not a foundation material. You could not specify it in a load calculation. 50-story buildings in living neighborhoods were not retaining walls. On the 8th night, Priya appeared behind her. Maya had the geotechnical file open. She heard the footsteps, registered them as Priya's by their particular rhythm, and had the window behind another tab in 3 seconds. Not closed, behind something else. The way you don't destroy evidence, you just don't present it. Priya looked at her screen. Maya looked at Priya. "You okay?" Priya said. Tired, which was true in the way that many true things are insufficient. Priya stood there for 1 beat longer than casual. Maya held steady. There was something in Priya's expression, not suspicion, something more complicated, something that looked like a person deciding whether to say a thing or leave it unsaid. And then Priya said goodnight and walked to the elevator, and Maya waited 4 minutes and opened the geotechnical file again. On the 11th night, she had what she needed. Not everything, not a complete case, but enough to know the shape of what she was looking at, which meant enough to know that looking away was a choice, and the choices about safety and load-bearing structures had outcomes that could not be walked back. She had thought about this moment in the abstract while she was building to it, had told herself that when she had enough, she'd know what to do. She had assumed she'd feel decisive. She felt instead like someone standing at the edge of a building, looking at the ground, understanding the physics perfectly, and understanding equally that understanding the physics did not make the steps smaller. She copied everything to an encrypted drive, a small black rectangle she carried in the lining of her coat. It pressed against her ribs when she moved, cold through the fabric. She became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound that doesn't stop, not constantly, but at intervals, in each interval a reminder. She had a weapon. She had not yet decided what she was willing to do with it, or what it was going to cost her. She rode the elevator down that night and walked through the lobby past the security desk, where the guard nodded at her, same as every night, and she nodded back and walked out and didn't let herself run. Above her, on the 44th floor, the server continued logging activity. Everything she touched, every file, every timestamp. She didn't know that yet, but somewhere in that building, someone else already did. Dominic Voss had been with Thorne Enterprises for 7 years, which was long enough to stop being a person and become a system. She hadn't understood this about him when she'd passed him in hallways, when she'd seen him in Thorne's glass-walled conference room at all hours, when she'd clocked the specific way the engineering team adjusted their posture when he walked onto the floor. She'd thought he was a protege. She'd been wrong. He wasn't someone Thorne had shaped. He was something Thorne had built, a mechanism for managing the distance between what the firm decided and what the firm needed to not be publicly true. He didn't execute plans. He managed exposure. There was a difference, and the difference was how far he'd been willing to go. She arrived on a Thursday morning to find her badge reading red at the door. She stood at the security terminal for 2 seconds, with her hand on the panel, looking at the red light, understanding what it meant, and understanding simultaneously that she had always known this was possible, that she had weighed it across 11 nights and concluded that it was a cost she was willing to bear. She had been correct in theory. Theory was different from standing here. The security guard, young, uncomfortable, doing a job that required him to pretend this wasn't happening, escorted her to her workstation to collect personal items. Her desk had been cleared already. Someone had come in before she'd arrived. Her laptop was gone. Her notebooks were gone. What remained was a framed photograph of Marcus at his 6th grade graduation, the one where he was grinning with his cap tilted at the wrong angle, looking like a boy who had not yet understood that the world had opinions about him, and a sealed envelope. Voss was waiting in the glass conference room, door open, the posture of a man conducting a routine function. She sat down and read the letter in full without looking up. Unauthorized access to non-project files, confidentiality agreement violation, potential legal exposure outlined in specific, dense language that had been written by someone whose entire professional function was making things unanswerable. She read every word because you didn't sign anything without reading it, and you didn't enter a room like this without knowing exactly what it said. She put the letter down. "You were in the UR files," Voss said. "I was running a server diagnostic, standard assigned work. You accessed the UR Phase 3 final folder 4 times over 22 days. You photographed documents from that folder on your personal device on the 17th at 11:42 p.m. The timestamp. She felt it land, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something she had suspected and pushed aside. They had known, not after the fact. They had watched her in real time and let her continue. She tried to think about why and found 2 answers, either to see how far she would go, to establish the scope of her access before moving, or because watching her itself was useful. Knowing what she knew told them what she might do with it. Both answers were sophisticated. She had underestimated him. "This is effective immediately," Voss said. "Security will return you to the lobby." He was already looking at his phone. Not dismissive. That would have required acknowledging her as a presence worth dismissing. Something colder, already moved to the next item. She thought about the encrypted drive. She thought about 47 photographs. She thought about whether any of it was enough without what she still didn't have, the external corroboration, the pre-existing regulatory restriction, the piece of evidence that lived outside the firm's walls and couldn't be reclassified into silence. She had good data and no mechanism to use it, not yet. She said nothing. She picked up Marcus's photograph and stood up and walked out with the security guard, and in the elevator she looked at the photograph and not at the guard and not at her own reflection in the steel door, and she thought about the retaining wall on Albemarle Road and the sound it had made and the fact that nobody had died only because of direction and luck. She thought, "I am not finished." She got home at 9:15. She made coffee she didn't drink. She sat at the kitchen table and was still sitting there when Marcus got home from school at 3:40, dropped his bag at the door, and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. "I lost my job," she said, which was true, which was also, she had decided sometime in the last 6 hours, not the end of the story. He sat down across from her, this boy, her brother's son, in her mother's apartment, in a building marked red on a map she'd photographed 47 times. At 7:50 that evening, the building's intercom buzzed 4 times in 10 minutes. She didn't need to answer it. The knocking started at 8 o'clock, first Mrs. Delacroix's door, audible through the floor, then others down the hall, then the lobby. Her phone rang at 8:30. Mrs. Delacroix's voice, stripped of its usual ironwork, thin in a way Maya had never heard it. 30 days, she said. They sent papers. 30 days. Voss had accelerated the eviction timeline. The same afternoon she was fired, the DE orders were hand-delivered to every unit in the building. Not posted, hand-delivered, which required a person, which meant it had been prepared in advance and held, waiting for exactly this moment, waiting for her to be no longer on the inside, where she might have been able to respond. She sat on the floor and listened to Mrs. Delacroix not crying on the phone, the particular sound of a person working very hard at a thing that was costing them significantly. "I hear you," Maya said. She hung up and sat there. Marcus's video game sounds drifted from his room. Ordinary Thursday evening, ordinary sounds, the world working the way it always had, except that it was dissolving around him and he didn't know it yet. She got up. She put the kettle on. She took out the encrypted drive and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it. 30 days was not very much time, but she had spent her entire adult life doing structural work with insufficient materials, and she knew better than most that the question was never whether you had enough. The question was whether you knew how to make what you had hold.
The rain came back on a Sunday like it remembered where it had left off. Maya stood at the corner of her block and let it. 11 days since she'd been walked out of Thorne Enterprises. She'd spent those 11 days doing what she knew how to do. She'd gone to lawyers, 3 of them. The first said compelling, the second said compelling and risky, the third said compelling, admissible, and badly timed. 6 weeks from a city council vote was not a litigation timeline, and even if it were, the internal documents she had were obtained in a gray area that Thorne's legal team would exploit until the vote was long past and the demolition was underway. She needed something they couldn't redact, something that predated Thorne, something that lived outside every firewall the firm had ever built. She'd been asking lawyers. She should have been asking the block. Mr. O'Coffer had lived on the ground floor of her building for 31 years. She knew this the way you know things about neighbors, as fact, unexamined, furniture in the background of a life. She did not know until she knocked on his door in the rain and he opened it, and she asked him point blank if he had anything from the community board going back to the early 2000s, that he had attended every single district board meeting since November 1997 and had kept the minutes, the filed objections, the resolutions, and the correspondence in 3-ring binders that occupied an entire shelf in his front closet, organized by year. He made tea while she started reading. The 2003 zoning amendment was in the 4th binder, 40 pages into a meeting transcript that was written in the particular bureaucratic prose designed to discourage reading. She read it anyway. She read it 3 times on her feet in his living room because she could not make herself sit down, because what it said, buried in a subsection of a conditional use revision that had been filed as a technical correction, was that the western parcels of the South Innovation Corridor, under the historic industrial reclassification of 1987, carried a tiered foundation restriction. No structure over 12 stories on those parcels could receive a building permit without independent third-party geotechnical review. Not the developer's review, third-party, independent, filed separately with the Department of Buildings. The restriction had been in force for 20 years. It had never been publicly repealed. She looked at Mr. O'Coffer. He was watching her over the rim of his tea mug with an expression she recognized, not surprise at what she'd found, but something closer to relief that someone else had finally found it. "Did you know about this?" she said. "I filed an objection in 2019, he said quietly, when they started the permit applications. Nobody called me back." She stood in his living room for another 10 seconds and looked at the binder and felt something rearrange itself in her chest. Not victory, nothing so simple as that, but the specific sensation of scattered load-bearing elements finally finding their alignment. Over the next 4 days, the block came to her. It didn't come organized. It came in pieces, in fragments, one person mentioning something to another, and that person knowing someone else, and Maya's kitchen table filling up incrementally with things that had been sitting in closets and shoeboxes and filing cabinets for years, kept not because anyone had a plan, but because they had the specific stubborn instinct of people who'd been in a city long enough to know that paper had weight.
Mrs. Delacroix had a folder of Con Edison easement records going back to 2009, kept because she didn't trust the city to remember its own obligations on the utility lines. Two of the Mencia brothers, who ran a small contracting business out of a van, did site prep work on two of the corridor parcels 18 months ago. They'd taken photographs. Their foreman had told them the soil sampling schedule was 3 days when it should have been 3 weeks, and he'd said so in writing to the site supervisor. And the Mencias had kept the email because you kept everything in writing when you worked construction in this city. The email was dated 6 weeks before the permit applications were submitted. On Tuesday night, Maya's phone rang from a blocked number. She almost didn't pick up. She picked up. Priya's voice was low and fast, the cadence of someone standing in a place they weren't supposed to be. The Phase 2 bearing reports, the original ones before revision, they're still in the shared audit server under the March 2023 archive. I don't know how long they stay. Breath. I can't be the one to pull them. I know, Maya said. I'm sorry I didn't. I know, Maya said again, softer this time. Thank you. The line went dead. Maya sat with the phone in her hand and thought about Priya at her workstation 8 months ago, flagging a drainage concern that disappeared into a Phase 2 review. She thought what it cost to notice something in a place that rewarded you for not noticing. She thought quiet courage looked different than the loud kind, but was not easier. She sat at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., surrounded by 30 years of her neighborhood's institutional memory, binders, photographs, emails, easement records, meeting minutes, soil sampling logs, and understood something that should have been obvious and wasn't. She had spent 9 months at Thorne Enterprises learning to think of the corridor as a development site. She'd been good at it, good enough that she'd almost forgotten what she'd known before she walked into that lobby, that the most accurate data about a place lived not in server folders or planning documents, but in the people who had been there long enough to pay attention. The city built on top of you, left you documentation in the debris. You just had to know it was there. She started building the presentation at 3 a.m. Marcus came out at some point, she didn't know what time, and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. "Is this going to work?" he said. She looked at everything spread in front of her, the binders, the photographs, the encrypted drive, the zoning amendment, flagged now on 3 different pages. "It's going to be close," she said. He stood there for a moment. He was wearing the hoodie he had since 7th grade, slightly too short in the arms now, and he looked so much like his father that it moved through her like weather. "Close is enough," he said. "Close is how you start." He went back to bed. Maya turned back to the table and kept building.
The council chambers smelled like carpet adhesive and old wood and the specific institutional weight of a building that had been used for its purpose long enough to believe in it. Maya arrived 40 minutes early. She sat in the back row first, alone, and looked at the room the way she always looked at structures, where the load sat, where the weak points were, what held the whole thing together and what only looked like it did. High ceilings, dark paneling, a raised dais for 11 council members positioned at exactly the elevation required to make citizens feel the mathematics of the room before anyone spoke. She'd been in rooms designed like this her whole life. She had learned how to stand in them anyway. She moved to the front. She set up her laptop. She confirmed the USB port on the chamber's presentation system. She'd called facilities 2 days ago, said she was a planning consultant confirming tech specs, because preparation and deception occupied a spectrum, and the stakes had made her comfortable further along it than she'd once been. She ran through her slides once, quietly, with the sound off. At 6:15, they started coming in. 47 people from her block, from the adjacent blocks, from the streets the red parcels had covered on the 3rd map. She knew some of them by name, some by face, some only by the specific geography of their daily routine. The woman who walked her dog past Maya's stoop at 7 a.m. every weekday. The man who smoked on the corner by the laundry on Saturday mornings. The couple from the 4th floor of the building next door, who she'd never spoken to, but whose window light she'd used as a landmark when coming home late. They came in without coordinating, which was its own kind of coordination, and they filled the public gallery from back to front in the particular pattern of people who had been told their whole lives to wait in the back and decided this one time not to. Mrs. Delacroix took the 2nd row.
She had her reading glasses on and her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had been planning to sit exactly here for a long time. Thorne's party arrived at 6:45. Legal team, 2 planning board members, 2 other men whose function she identified as witness rather than participant, the kind of presence that meant someone wanted a record. Thorne himself sat in the reserved section with the composure of a man who had attended many city council votes and found them all to be, ultimately, manageable. Voss sat 3 seats to his left. He saw her when she turned from the presentation screen. Something happened behind his eyes, a rapid recalculation, there and gone, replaced with the careful flatness of a man who had trained himself not to react, but she had seen it. It mattered that she had seen it. She was given 3 minutes at the podium. She used 4. Nobody stopped her. She did not speak about community. She did not speak about displacement, about legacy, about the human geography of 18 blocks and the 30-year lives lived in them, though all of that was true and present and sitting in the gallery behind her in the form of 47 people who had brought it with them. Those arguments were true, and they were losable. She had 4 minutes, and she was going to spend every second of them on ground that could not be moved. She spoke about the 2003 zoning amendment. She put the relevant subsection on the screen, the original document, scanned from Mr. Okofer's binder, his handwriting, in pencil, margin noting the filed objection he'd submitted in 2019, the tiered foundation restriction, the independent third-party review requirement, the requirement that had existed in law for 22 years and had not been honored in Thorne Enterprises permit applications, which had been approved anyway. She put that on the screen. Then she put up both sets of geotechnical data, the internal data from the Phase 2 archive, time-stamped from Thorne's own servers, and the data that had been submitted to the planning board, side by side, same parcels, same coordinates, different numbers. She let the room look at them. She looked at the council members while they looked at the screen. She watched the moment when the distance between the 2 datasets registered, not as a discrepancy, not as a measurement variation, but as what it actually was. She watched one council member lean to another and point at a specific row. She watched a second council member take off his glasses and put them back on. She watched the 3rd district member, a woman who sat on this board for 11 years and heard everything and reacted to almost none of it, go very still. The chamber held the specific silence of a room collectively processing something it had not expected to see. "Return to the geotechnical comparison," the 3rd district member said. Maya returned to it. "These are from the same parcels." "Yes." "Commissioned by the same firm." The internal data was commissioned by Thorne Enterprises for design purposes. The submitted data was filed with the planning board 9 weeks later. A pause. "And the discrepancy is not a measurement variation. It's 2 different data sets, one of which triggered code-required mitigation standards, one of which did not." The room absorbed this. She looked at Thorne. He had not moved since she'd first put the data on the screen. He was watching her with the same measuring attention she'd first seen on a rain-soaked sidewalk 14 months earlier. But the quality of it had shifted. On the sidewalk, he was evaluating what he'd found. Now he was looking at the full structure of it, the thing built from that moment forward, and he could see him taking in its dimensions. A man who built things, seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, what had been built in his name. Voss leaned to him and spoke close to his ear. Thorne's jaw tightened once. He did not respond. The council voted to table the demolition approval pending independent review. It was not an exoneration, it was not a parade, it was the thing structural victories were made of, a foundation laid in the right material, in the right configuration, on a ground that had been properly assessed. Everything that came next would need to be built on top of it. Maya stepped back from the podium and walked to the gallery. Mrs. Delacroix put her hand briefly on Maya's arm, 2 seconds, no more, said nothing, which was Mrs. Delacroix's way of saying everything. Outside in the corridor, one of the Mencia brothers was shaking someone's hand. Mr. Okofer was standing near the door with his binder under his arm, looking like a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and had just put it down. Maya stood in the middle of it and let it be real for 30 seconds.
Then she took out her phone and started making notes for what came next. Because the foundation was laid, the building wasn't finished, and she was above all things an engineer.
Dominic Vass was gone by the following Thursday. No press release, no severance announcement. One email to the full firm, 8 lines, the specific language of institutional self-preservation, transition, restructuring, Thorn Enterprises' commitment to its core values. By Friday, his office had been cleared with the same efficiency that had been applied to Maya's workstation 6 weeks earlier. She noticed the symmetry and filed it away without satisfaction, because satisfaction required a simplicity that this situation had never had and would not have now. She was at her kitchen table, not the 44th floor, her kitchen table, Marcus's geometry homework spread on the end of it, when Thorn called, 8:40 a.m. She'd been awake since 5. He told her the independent review had confirmed the geotechnical discrepancy, that the planning board was conducting a formal investigation into the permit approval process, that the firm had retained external counsel, that Vass had acted, in certain respects, without his knowledge. And here she heard something in his voice that was not quite an apology, a man not accustomed to the word discovering its weight, but that this did not constitute a defense, only a fact. She listened to all of it. He told her the urban renewal initiative was being restructured, not abandoned. He was precise about this in the way of a man who built things for a living and was not willing to stop building them, and she respected the precision even while understanding that it was also the argument she would have to hold him to. Not abandoned, rebuilt from a different foundation, with different assumptions, different accountability structures, different personnel. He was offering her a role. "I've heard this offer before," she said. A pause, short but real. "This is a different offer," he said. "Lead the integration team, design the new development model, community consultation built into every phase, not as a communication strategy, as an engineering constraint. Zoning restrictions honored in full, third-party review independent of the firm, filed with the city directly. You hire your own geotechnical team." She let the silence run for a moment. She had conditions, and she'd had them ready for days, because she had known that if she was going to be offered a second chance to do this right, she needed to walk in with the architecture already designed. The 2003 restriction stands, in writing, in the project charter, not just in practice. Yes. Community board has formal review rights, every phase, binding, not advisory. A pause, longer this time. "I'll have legal draft the language. I'll review the language before it's filed." The shortest pause yet. "Yes," he said. She looked out the window, her street in the thin October light. She could see the corner where she'd dragged the broken curbing through the rain. The pothole was still there, still unpatched, still exactly the size and shape it had been on the night that had started all of this. The city hadn't fixed it. She'd stopped expecting the city to fix things it could ignore. That was not defeat. That was just clarity about what needed doing and by whom. She thought about what she was agreeing to. Not with starry eyes. She'd lost that somewhere around the second time she'd ran a diagnostic and found data that shouldn't exist. She was agreeing to work inside a system that betrayed her, with a man who had employed someone who destroyed her professionally and then accelerated the eviction of her home as a secondary measure of control. She was agreeing to this because the alternative was watching the corridor get developed by people with clean degrees and compromised data, and she had stood at that fork before and knew which road it ended on. She was agreeing to it because Marcus's school was still yellow on a map she intended to change, and the only people who changed maps were the people who made themselves indispensable to the cartographers. "When do I start?" she said. There was something in the silence before he answered. Not warmth, not exactly, but the specific quality of a man who recognized the phrase because he'd heard it once before, in a room above a different street, on a day that it turned out to matter. Recognition. And beneath it, something that might have been respect or might have been the beginning of it. "Monday," he said. She started on Monday. The first thing she did was pull all permit applications in the corridor and audit it against the zoning archive Mr. Okapa had spent 31 years maintaining. The second thing she did was call Priya, who answered on the second ring, and ask her to lead the independent geotechnical team, which Priya agreed to with the particular compression of someone who had been waiting to be asked for a long time. The third thing she did was convene a community meeting, not in a boardroom, not on a 44th floor, in the laundromat on Clement Street, which had enough folding chairs and the particular advantage of being a room where everyone already knew how to wait.
She sat at a table at the front and told 30 people exactly what the development plan was, exactly what was wrong with it, exactly what she intended to change, and exactly where she would fail them if she wasn't held accountable. Mr. Okapa raised his hand. The eastern drainage, before anything else gets built. The east side floods every March. I know, it's first. He nodded once and put his hand down. 18 months later, Maya brought Marcus to the site on a Saturday. He came because she had asked, and he was 16 now, and 16 exercised its indifference carefully, which meant when he chose to show up, it meant something. They stood at the edge of the first completed building in the new corridor, 7 stories, mixed income, foundation piles drilled to verified bedrock by Priya's team under full independent survey. A community garden on the second-floor terrace designed in 10 meetings over 3 months with 19 residents who actually lived there. The east side drainage solved first the way she promised. Marcus stood next to her in his hard hat, which he wore at the angle that teenagers wore things they'd been required to wear, and looked at the building for a long time. He had his father's eyes, his grandmother's eyes, the eyes that looked at everything the world offered with the combination of hunger and skepticism that this family's oldest inheritance, the thing that was passed down not because it was chosen, but because it was required, the trait that let them survive long enough to build. "You built this," he said. "A lot of people built this, but you did the math." I smiled. I checked the math. He nodded in the considering way he had, the way of a boy turning into a person, trying the weight of things before committing. Then he took his phone out and photographed the building. Just took a picture of it, just quiet and simple, the way you document something real. She watched him, this boy her brother left in the world, this boy who had done his geometry homework at the kitchen table where she'd collected evidence that, in one way or another, led to this street, this building, this morning. He didn't know all of it. She would tell him some of it when he was older, the parts that were his to carry, the parts that were Kofi's. She looked back at the building, the steel and concrete honest about what it held, the foundation built for the actual ground and not a version of it that was easier to approve. She pulled her own hard hat on and walked towards the site entrance, and the mud was there, same as always, the way mud was always at the base of every building that had ever been built anywhere. This was not a problem. This was the nature of ground. Her boots were good ones. She knew exactly where to step. And above her, the building rose, 7 stories clean into the October sky, and it would still be standing in 50 years, and that was what she'd come to do, and she had done it, and that was enough. That was more than enough.